An opera is a multivalent, crazy art form, and you find that when you make one thing a given, everything else moves around it. So if it's this opera is going to star this soprano, suddenly the date moves to a time that she's available, the repertoire becomes something that she's comfortable with, the room becomes a theater that's appropriate to her, etc. The cast becomes a cast that supports her. It's odd that one given makes everything else move around it. And the same was true, that the given was I was going to come to this company and we were going to produce operas, and everything else we had to figure out. The difficulty was that the turnaround plan really wasn't feasible. It contained wishful thinking on the revenue side that meant that it wasn't sustainable, and so I needed to look very carefully at what the realities were. And I had this sense in the first year, like, how is it that my predecessors were able to do 16 operas for $40 million, and I can't do 5 operas for $30 million? The answer was that they didn't do 16 operas for $40 million. They ran very, very large deficits every year. Oddly, though troubling that information was, it was a relief, because it meant I wasn't being held to a standard that was unachievable, rather that it cost more money. The flip side of that was that I knew, because I've put on operas from the ground up, I know what everything costs in an opera. And so if I were walking down the street and somebody handed me $30 million and said, hey, can you do 5 operas, kid? The answer is 5. How about 10? How about 15? Of course I can do that. But here was a company that had a gigantic cost structure of overhead. And opera is an overhead business. It's really a 19th century kind of business. But in this case, the overhead had eaten the company alive. There was nothing left to make art with. In fact, there was insufficient money just to stand perfectly still. So the task was to look at the overhead, to completely restructure it, and to put as much of the money on stage as we possibly could. And that was a kind of thrilling problem to discover and to work out a solution for. If you look around the country, there are 2 kinds of opera company. There are the big ones that have big contracts, and there are all the others. The big ones are the Metropolitan Opera, the Chicago Lyric Opera, San Francisco Opera, and New York City Opera. If we look back when New York City Opera was doing its most amount of work, Metropolitan Opera was doing about 24 productions a season on a $300 million budget. Chicago Lyric Opera was doing, let's say, 8 productions a season, roughly on a $60 million budget, so much smaller. San Francisco was doing those 8 productions around for $80 million, and New York City Opera was doing 16 productions for $40 million. It was a huge amount of work with very, very little money. In our new size, having cut out all this overhead, we're doing 5 productions on a $13 million budget. So it's just a much, much smaller company. So we have to reshape the contracts we have to match the new reality. Our old contracts, you buy time by the week, and you pay everybody whether they work or not. So if you want the orchestra, you can't have a flute. You have all 60 or 70 members of the orchestra. You can't have them for 10 minutes. You can't have them for an hour. You can't have them for 3 hours. You have to buy them for a week. That makes sense if the amount of work you're doing is higher than that guaranteed minimum, but it is crushing to the organization if the amount of work you're doing is in fact below that minimum. You end up spending money on people not working, and while it's extremely difficult for the people who are used to getting the money to suddenly not get the money, there's no way the company could continue without that change. For us, it's very important to be focused on what goes on the stage and what is behind the stage, what's the administrative cost. And at New York City Opera, the overhead had grown to be gigantic, and what was left over to put on the stage was tiny. And those overhead costs grow and grow and grow. They have their own people motivating the costs to grow. Each cost area has a vocal champion who wants that cost area to be bigger and bigger and bigger. But ultimately, the success or failure of the company is about putting wonderful art on the stage. And so one needs to go through the budget area by area to find out what really matters and what doesn't matter, and also to respond to the exterior economy in ways that make sense. You know, there are different solutions for every different economic situation.